Hello, everybody. Here is Michael from the New Left, and today we have a new guest. We are talking with Sofia Rajseka. Sophie, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Sofia. I'm based here in Vienna in my office. I'm a trade unionist. I'm working for the white-collar trade union, GPA. So we're representing workers in different sectors in private industries. So for instance, in commerce, in finance industries, but also in pharmaceutical industries and automotive industries, for instance. And my job is to represent our trade union movement in Europe and also to support Works Council members, trade union members with international relations.
Okay, thank you. Can you introduce GPA to Slovaks? Because, well, you know, trade unions in Austria, it's a big unknown, I would imagine. So what is it about, when it started? How did you end up in the union, you know?
Sure thing. Maybe I start by explaining that in Austria, we have one trade union umbrella organization. It's called Österreichischer Gewerkschaftsbund, the Austrian Trade Union Confederation, in short, ÖGB, the OGB. And under this umbrella, there are different trade unions representing different kinds of workers. So we have unions that are in charge of public servants. We've got other unions that are in charge of blue-collar workers, so the traditional blue-collar workers, mainly in manufacturing industries. And then there is GPA, and this is the only trade union in Austria representing white-collar workers in the different sectors and industries. But we're all one trade union family, so to speak, within one umbrella organization, the OGB. So we're not really competing with each other. It's quite clear which trade union is in charge of which workplace, which kind of worker, and what kind of contract. And we're cooperating within the OGB, of course, on political issues to represent the workers' interests as a whole towards the government and employers' organizations, so to speak.
So how many trade union associations are there in Austria altogether? Just to into perspective, as far as I know, in Slovakia, we have 26 such organizations. So when you say GPA focuses on white-collar workers, that means doctors, I don't know, teachers, nurses, and so on, everything that is white-collar. You know,
that's
where are the hazy?
Yeah.
No, that's why I'm asking.
I get it. Yeah. So there are two trade unions in the public industries. So in the public servants, these represent, for instance, as you mentioned, the teachers or the nurses in public hospitals, for instance. So two trade unions in charge of all of the public servants. And then we have got the blue-collar workers. There we've got one organization, ProG, representing the manufacturing industry. So very traditionally, the workers in automotive industries, and in the well, also in technologies, when that's what electronics to produce them. So this is one. Then the second trade union in charge of blue-collar workers is the Bauholz. So they're the construction workers, quite clear, I think, who they represent. Then we've got postal workers as well. So they're a bit of a mixture of public and blue-collar workers. And then we've got the VIDA. VIDA is a mixture, or actually a merger from different trade unions, representing mainly the railway workers and also in hospitality, so in hotels, restaurants. So these workers are covered by VIDA as well.
So altogether, how many trade union associations are there in Austria?
7. So we've
seven.
Got 7.
Only 7. Okay.
Only 7 compared to Slovakia. That's much
yeah,
less
well,
indeed.
No,
there used to be much more trade unions in Austria in the past. So for very
they
on a sectoral
together,
level,
I guess. Yeah,
and during the decades they merged, exactly. So for instance, GPA, well, we represent white-collar workers, meaning in banks and sales, for instance, in the retail. So when you go to a supermarket, those workers are represented by GPA as well. Then white-collar workers, as I mentioned, for instance, in pharmaceutical companies, so scientists, so to speak, but also other types of white-collar workers. So just to give a few examples whom we represent. But we also have, funnily, a few blue-collar workers in our trade union, because about 20 years ago, GPA merged with the former printers and journalists trade union, because printers, they used to be a really strong and proud trade union, but the industry is in decline for decades. So they lost a lot of memberships because there simply weren't any workers anymore in the printing sector. And that's why they decided to rather merge with another trade union, because it's better to be together, to be a bigger organization, a stronger organization to represent the interests. Also because, of course, that the funding is getting less when you've got less members. So in Austria, we usually fund ourselves as trade unions solely on membership basis. Mm-hmm. So every trade union member pays 1% of their salary as a monthly fee to the trade unions. And this is the basis on which we work. So my salary is actually financed by all of the trade union members in GPA.
Mm-hmm. This is the discussion I want to have with you. We know the differences between Austria and Slovakia. Here, obviously, is one difference that we are running 26 union associations, maybe 25, maybe 27, but something in that ballpark. And you are at 7, which is, well, obviously quite less. And as far as I know, the penetration in Austria then is somewhere around 30%, so 30. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
But that's what I heard altogether, all of Austrian workers. So roughly 1/3 is unionized. And now the question is about the collective bargaining agreements and the art, the way how collective bargaining agreements are negotiated in Austria, because that's a big difference compared to Slovakia. You don't have any minimal wage set up by government. We do. And when people are talking about Austria, our direct neighbor, and we used to be for hundreds of years in the same kind of Reich or whatever, so, you know, there is certain affinity towards Austria. People get confused about these collective bargaining agreements and these minimal wages because it's a different model. So if you could please explain it a bit, how GPA, for example, negotiates this minimal wage. Is it then set up for all of GPA members? Is it set up for all of the industries? You know, nitty-gritty details, how it's got done, because it's something totally different to Slovakia.
I agree. Not only totally different to Slovakia, but I think
most countries,
unique within Europe.
As far as I know, only you and the Danish don't have minimal wage, but or the Denmark, or how to put it, but unions negotiate the minimum wage in this collective bargaining round. So if I'm wrong, then I apologize. But you are pretty unique, as you said yourself. No?
So when it comes to legal, to statutory minimum wages, so when a government sets minimum wages, there is just a handful of countries in Europe where there's no such system. This is, as you said, Austria and also Denmark. So the Scandinavian countries, also Sweden, for instance, they don't have a statutory minimum wage. And Italy doesn't have one either. And in all of the other countries in Europe, it is normal to have this statutory minimum wage where the government sets the minimum level. In Austria, we, to put it bluntly, never needed it. This is a very...
you needed it, but you achieved it differently, I guess.
Well, and we didn't need a statutory minimum wage because we have a different framework. And this was set up over 100 years ago, actually. So after World War I, you know, back then it was two main political powers, the conservatives and the social democrats. And they represent funnily similar interests as the employers and the trade unions. And back then we set up a system based on social partnership. So we call it the social partners, employers and trade unions. They are social partners. They negotiate. So on the one hand, on wages, for instance, on working conditions, but they also represent the interests towards the government. But let's leave the government part out for now. Let's focus on the collective bargaining. The very great thing we have is a legal framework that allows us to negotiate on sectoral level together with the employers on the other side. And basically the legal framework says that every employer in Austria is obliged to be a member of the so-called Wirtschaftskammer, the Chamber of Commerce. So we have a legal representation of employers on the one side. And on the other side,
jump in, obliged means everyone has to be there. Exactly. Everyone has to be there. Everyone.
Yeah, and they also have to pay a certain membership fee, and the the duty, of course, of the Chamber of Commerce is to represent their interests.
So
they
sorry
get
again to
back
jump
as
in.
well.
So that means if you want to run a business in Austria, you have to be member of this.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
Even if it's just one person being active in this company. So if you set up a company to sell something or to do some services in the IT sector, for instance, then you set up a business, and with this business you are obliged to be a member of this Chamber of Commerce.
And pay membership fee and be
pay
part
a membership
of it.
fee.
Okay, got it.
And in case your company grows and you have an employee or 2 or 7, then you have to pay them according to the respective collective agreement. Because the Chamber of Commerce, together with the trade unions, negotiate collective agreements on the industry level, more or less, and they apply to all of the workers in this industry, whether they are a trade union member or not. They have a right to have this kind of minimum wage set by the collective agreement. So this is one part
when you're
of the
talking about this, as you said yourself, GPA is amalgam from multiple trade unions. So you're actually negotiating multiple minimum wages for multiple industries, or how is it done in GPA?
Exactly. So collective agreements in Austria usually are negotiated on an annual basis. So we don't set up one collective agreement and it's just the same minimum wage forever, but we negotiate on an annual level.
So
exactly.
Different industries have different minimum wages depending on the negotiation.
Yes.
In some industries, the union is stronger, so they get more. In some, it's weaker, they get less, something like that?
Yes.
Okay,
so we have,
got it.
within GPA, we have about 170 different collective agreements.
Oh la la.
And of course, other trade unions have a number of collective agreements as well.
So it's a jungle of okay. So
it is a jungle,
200 or 300 collective agreements altogether, and then
probably
there is only one minimum
Yes.
wage. So all the other wages, in my logic, has to be bigger than the minimum wage of whatever the industry is, where the minimum wage is the lowest. Yeah.
Well, that's quite a bit simplifying it.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to understand it so that the audience understands it.
Indeed, there are different levels of minimum wage varying from the sector. So when you start working for an automotive metal industry company, for instance, as a worker, probably your wage will be higher than when you start working in retail, in a supermarket, because they are, the union density varies in these sectors, and we have stronger representation of trade unionists in the metal industries, meaning we have more power as a trade union to show the employers that if they don't raise the wages, then we can go on strike. There are a lot of trade union members willing to go on strike to get a higher level of payment. In the retail, also in the supermarkets and other retailers, it is more difficult to have trade union members. They often change jobs or much more often during their lifetime than in the metal industries, for instance. So it's more difficult to build this kind of trade union power. So when we negotiate the wages for commerce, for the retailers, then we can't really threaten the employer with having a strike, because probably we won't have enough people involved to actually go on strike, or only in a few companies, or for a shorter time. So we have different levels of minimum wages across the sectors in the different industries. That's something that you said, and I agree with that. But we coordinate as trade unions. We've got one umbrella organization, as mentioned earlier, and we set our goals and part of our strategy together. So for instance, we have set a goal years ago that there shouldn't be any minimum wage below 1,700 euros per month. So we usually count as a monthly wage. And this was the goal set, and all of the negotiations tried to achieve this goal. This did not work out in all of the sectors within 1 year. Sometimes it took 2 years or 3, but we really managed to step up the whole minimum wage issue through negotiations through a period of a few years. And now the last goal was to exceed the 2,000 euros per month. So in theory, when you are full-time employed, so 30 hours or 40 hours per week, and you work, whether it be in retail or in metal industries, you should gain at least 2,000 euros per month. But of course, in some of the industries that are better organized, the minimum wage level still is much higher. But we're pretty much trying to push from the bottom to.
Question: when it's such a jungle of 170 only in GPA, so I imagine around 300 negotiations, are the minimum wages somehow transparently somewhere on the internet so that you know that this industry set up minimum wage, I don't know, whatever, and I want to go somewhere, obviously, where I can make the choice where the wages are higher. So is it like disclosed, or are all these negotiations somehow, kind of secret, or how it's done?
Well, the negotiations themselves, they take
but
place
the
in a
results
closed room.
the
results, sometimes you can find a collective agreement on the internet, sometimes you don't, because this is something where we trade unions, for instance, decided that we don't want to make all of the collective agreements public, so that our trade union members have kind of an extra service that they receive the collective agreements.
Okay.
But if you're not a trade union member, then it's not as easy to find, or maybe even impossible to find on the internet, because collective agreements, it's not only wages. It's a lot of other stuff as well. I mentioned earlier, full-time employment, 38 or 40 hours per week. So legally, the full-time work week is 40 hours. But in a lot of collective agreements, we managed to have a 38-hour work week, for instance, or in some others even lower, 37 and a half. So collective bargaining means negotiating wages, but also negotiating working time and negotiating a lot of other issues as well. For instance, the period of termination could vary from collective agreement to collective agreement, or that you get some extra benefits, some extra vacation days when you, we've got some collective agreements, for instance, when your kid starts school, that you have an extra vacation day or two, that you can transition, manage to transition better. So in some collective agreements, there are some extras or some details that are not covered in other collective agreements, which makes it quite a complicated legal text as well.
Gotcha.
So it's good to have trade unionists to interpret it for your individual case. But these are sometimes really thick kind of folders or booklets with a lot of regulations that are valid for your workplace then.
Another question about these negotiations. When I was talking to this lady from Verdi, she told me that Verdi is trying to negotiate something extra for the union members, like extra vacation days, stuff like that. Does GPA do something similar? Because I was surprised. In Slovakia, we play this game at least when I'm working as a trade union, that everyone gets the same. Yeah, doesn't matter whether you are in the trade union or not. This negotiation applies to every worker in the company. So, well, I was actually inspired. This is a good strategy to kind of motivate people to become member of the trade union. So, how is it done in GPA? Do you have this kind of game to get something extra for the members?
No. This really is valid for all of the workers in the industry. It doesn't matter if you're a trade union member or not. You get the wage raise, you get the other definitions.
No, obviously there is benefits. A certain bottom that is valid for everyone, but whether you negotiate something extra only for the members, like as Silke said, extra vacation days, stuff like that, because, well, looked like, that's something we should be striving for so that we increase the membership base.
It definitely is a strategy that many trade unions use, or the systems in the different countries vary here as well. In Austria, we don't do it. Okay. We really negotiate for all of the workers, and there are no extra benefits for trade union members via collective bargaining. Of course, there are some extra benefits as a trade union member. For instance, you have got a legal question about your situation, or if the termination was correct, or if you should receive more money. And as a trade union member, you can come here to the trade union or just phone them and ask the question. You will receive an answer and some legal counsel for free. And if you're not a trade union member, you of course don't have this possibility. So
obviously,
this is kind of the difference in the services, of course, and the interpretation of the collective agreement. But when it comes to rights, through the collective agreement, we don't do this, but it's true other trade unions in other countries, they do this, yeah.
Thank you. Another thing I wanted to discuss with you is how GPA is running things, because when I'm talking to trade unionists in Slovakia, we have different model than GPA has, or Verdi, or the other trade unions I spoke with recently, and that is the strategy in Slovakia is that the money stays at the company level, at the union company level. Roughly 70-30 split is done there, and only 30%, 30, go to the trade association or the union association, and 70% stays on the company level. Whereas in Austria or Germany, and that's the discussion I wanted to have with you, how is Europe set up, and where are the differences between these different approaches, how to run a trade union, a big one in country, because, well, there is something that, or this is something that you are doing differently in Austria. So if you could please explain this in more detail, how it's done. And one question where it leads to, as far as I know, GPA has around 200 or 300 employees, something in that ballpark. So if you could comment on that, because when you put it into perspective with our biggest trade union, which is running less than 30 employees, so it's the magnitude of 1,000%. So that's a lot, if it's really 300 employees for GPA.
A bit less, but about that indeed.
Okay.
In Austria, as I mentioned earlier, every trade union member pays 1% of the salary. So this is, we don't really have a flat rate, so to speak, because as I mentioned, in retail, for instance, you earn less, and in other industries you earn more. So to have some relativity here. And these membership fees, they go directly.
Sorry to jump in. This 1%, is it paid by the member, or is it paid by the employee? Not obviously, but you know, whether it's disclosed and the company is paying it, and they know that this person is a member of the union, because in Slovakia, in some unions, it's not secret, and the company pays it. And in some companies, it's secret, and proactively the member has to pay it. And then there is the kind of question, you know, because when you don't disclose your salary, you can pay less because no one can control you. So how it's done in Austria?
Of course. Okay, then let's start here maybe before we go into the financing debate.
No, this is interesting for folks to know, and for me as well, how you're doing things, no? Where are the differences?
So you're not obliged to tell your employer that you're a trade union member, of course. And in many cases, people want to feel protected and don't want the employer to know that they're a trade union member. But in many companies, we have a kind of an agreement with the company that they subtract the trade union fee from the salary and bring it
automatically
to
the company.
Exactly.
Okay.
But this is only in a few companies where we have an agreement and a good understanding with the management. In other companies, it's really an individual payment by the member from their bank account, so to speak, to the trade union bank account. And there, to a certain degree, of course, we have to trust what they're telling us their salary is.
Okay, then it's totally the same approach as in Slovakia. Okay, got it. I just thought that maybe it's disclosed and maybe everywhere it's automated because, well, whatever. No? That's why I was asking. Okay, and now about the other things that I was asking.
And well, the whole fee gets to the GPA bank account, and we have to pay a little bit to our umbrella organization, to the OGB, because they don't have members themselves. We as trade unions have the members. So we pay a little bit to the OGB to co-finance the umbrella organization.
Percentage-wise, if you can disclose it?
I don't know.
Okay.
But the majority really remains within GPA and not on a company level or someplace else, but at the trade union, there is, well, the budget there.
When I was speaking with Verdi a few days back, they had roughly 450 million euros from membership Well, payments, and as far as I know, IG Metall has around 600 millions from membership. I don't know what GPA is getting, but they probably not in this ballpark. But it's not like 1,700 euros. Yeah. So when you can pay 300 or almost 300 employees, then it's a nice lump sum of money.
Yeah.
No?
I can't tell you about the budget details, but indeed, a lot of our resources go into staff, into employees of the trade union, which is important because I mentioned earlier what we are selling are our services as well. So it's collective bargaining, but trade union members get a certain service. So we have a structure that we have, of course, the headquarters here in Vienna. That's where I'm employed. But in every so-called Bundesland, so in all of the regions in Austria, we have smaller offices as well, which is important because members or works councils, and we can speak about the role of works councils later on as well, they have questions, they need assistance, legal support, strategy support, whatever. And here the local offices step in. So it's much easier to have a local office in every region and to speak to the company representatives locally than doing everything just from Vienna. Austria is a very small country. Nevertheless, when you drive from one end to the country to the other one, it will take you hours. So you have to have this local representation.
So how widely are you spread? As far as I know, you have 8 Bundesländer. How many? Nine.
Yeah.
Vienna as well. Okay, so only 9 offices are all in all in Austria. It's not like it goes to some bigger cities and there is another office. 9 offices. That's how it's set up.
It depends on the region. So we have got some regions that are larger, where we have even smaller offices, somewhere in the periphery as well. But basically, in every region, we have one office.
At least one office is there
exactly.
in some.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
Yes. And then we've got the headquarters, where, of course, the usual things what are private companies doing. So when you've got your IT infrastructure, your accounting, these are the typical services that usually take place in the headquarters. But something that we have in the headquarters as well as on a regional level is to have lawyers, legal experts. When we assist members to go to court because the termination was not correct or they have been discriminated against, then they get assistance from trade union legal counsels, from lawyers, and they, of course, cost some money, which is why important that we have the money as a trade union organization, that we can finance this stuff. And it's easier to have it in-house, to have legal experts in-house employed by GPA, than paying an external lawyer to do all of this work, because it's far more expensive and they're not that specialized in labor law and in worker representation interests as we are. So I think this is really a strong call to have solid finances as a trade union.
Question about the amount of lawyers you're actually employing. What is it, couple of dozens or only just few heads, or couple of dozens?
I don't really have the head.
I guess you don't know exactly, but it's like
a couple of dozens.
It's not like it's one dude somewhere in the corner crying because he's overworked all the time.
No, it's
because in Slovakia it's the case. So
poor boy or girl.
Well, it is what it is. This is how it's set up in Slovakia. That's why we are having this discussion, to see the differences and what are the benefits of this different setup that Austria is running.
Sure. And also we've got so-called trade union officers or secretaries. They are in charge of different companies. So they're the ones liaising with the works council members there, trying to help negotiate on a company level and so on. So these are not necessarily lawyers, but they, through experience, learned a lot about labor law as well. And then we have, as a type of employment, we also have youth officers, for instance. So as GPA, we really try to organize young people as well. So we approach people in schools, but especially on universities, and young workers in the workplace, to attract them to the trade union, to explain why it's important to be organized. And these are youth officers. So in every region, we have got at least one youth officer as well, really targeting young workers, which can pay off. For instance, I was organized, or I joined the trade union when I was 15, so a very long time ago, and I stayed. So I stayed as an activist for over a decade, and at some point I got a job offer to work for the trade union, and so I'm still here 20 years later. So this really is a strategy that can pay off as well, but of course it costs some money to have these youth officers as well in our structures. And I think because we were speaking about collective bargaining earlier, something that is important to mention is that we also have like a collective bargaining department. So there is a handful of colleagues in charge solely of collective bargaining on the sectoral level. They, of course, have to cover different sectors and collective agreements. But we have our experts that have been working in the same sectors for years, so know the collective agreement very well, negotiating these collective agreements on an annual basis.
Okay, and the question I have about these lawyers, because this is interesting, because I know the situation in Slovakia that the lawyers that are usually or often used by Slovak unionists are working also for the employers. So how is the situation in Austria? I assume, but that's why I'm asking the question, my assumption is that the lawyers that you are using at GPA are solely lawyers for the union, and if such a lawyer would go to an employer, then I guess he or she will be terminated. Tell me otherwise. That's why I'm asking. But certain conflict of interest is seen in Slovakia, and I imagine you are more strict than we are in Slovakia, or maybe not.
Look, it depends. So, of course, if it's our in-house lawyers, they are here only for the trade union. Sure, they're not going to represent the company. So they are employed by GPA or by another trade union. They are our workers. So that's their job. That's their job description. But I don't want to exaggerate. Of course, we can't handle everything in-house. So sometimes we have to give a case to a law firm, to a law office as well, because it's very complicated. We need someone to really push it. Sometimes law firms also have better connections to follow up. So there are some cases where we also cooperate with law firms. And sure, there are some law firms that are more trade union friendly and others that are more employer friendly. But in general, law firms are law firms. So they take a client, whomever they take. So of course, with them, sometimes it can happen that they have different cases, or that we work at some point with a lawyer that ends up in company law later on in his career. But this is not really the norm. So we have some trusted law officers, of course, with which we've been cooperating for a long time. Still, okay, it's a private industry. They can do what they want. They have their clients.
But you prefer not to have these gray zones, something like that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Gotcha. And the discussion I wanted to have with you is about the European level of trade unions, because, well, you are responsible for the European contacts and actually pan-European contacts, as far as I know, in GPA. So if you can kind of disclose what you learned about the European Union, about the post-communistic countries and Western countries, where are the models? Because as far as I know, but that's the question, the Slovak model isn't unique only in Slovakia, this 70-30 setup that the majority of the money stays on the level in the company. How is it in other countries? And I'm specifically interested in Slovenia, because Slovenia has the best unionization from post-communistic countries. So my guess and suspicion is that they have a different model, but maybe not. Please tell us what you know.
The history of trade union movement is very different in all of the countries, and the systems nowadays are the result of decades and hundreds of years sometimes, and also of cultures. I mentioned at the very beginning of this interview that in Austria we have got the social partnership. So the aim is that trade unions and employers negotiate and find a compromise. Compromises are not always easy and nice, but this is the way we do it in Austria. In other countries, it's much more about conflict. So for instance, in France or in UK, no, sorry.
That's okay.
So for instance, in France or in Italy and also in United Kingdom, the history of trade union movement came from much more conflict. And in order to negotiate, they need to start a conflict, a strike or some kind of action to actually get to the negotiation table. So this is a completely different way to approach things than we do it in Austria, for instance. So starting at the negotiating table or starting with conflict. And another thing that is quite different in these countries is that, or in some countries, is that we've got different trade unions that are also in conflict between each other. So in Italy, in France, for instance, you have got political trade unions. They originated from anarchist groups, from communist groups, socialist groups, Christian groups. So they originated from a very political background. And of course, they're not as strongly anarchist or communist nowadays as they were probably 120 years ago. But still, there are different trade union confederations with different points of view, how to approach things, how to negotiate, or if even to negotiate with the government. And they are also in a workplace, there are different trade unions present. So it can be that there are 2, 3, or even 7 different trade unions represented in one workplace, in one company, with a number of members, which is not going to happen in
Actually,
in
this
Austria
is not going to
clear.
happen in Austria because you also centralize. Now, when you have only 7 union associations, that this conflict of interests are non-existent, I would imagine.
Exactly.
No?
Yeah.
And about the
So
centralization in other countries, Austria is like the best practice, the decentralization,
no, not necessarily.
But 7 is well, compared to Slovakia and 26, it's quite centralized. So how is it when you compare yourself with other countries? Are you kind of on the top of centralization and the conflict of interest is minimized, or how does it look?
Yes, of course, there are different systems. For instance, in the Nordics, the Scandinavian countries, they have usually about 3 umbrella organizations, so different trade unions, but they are not in conflict at all because they represent different types of workers. So public workers are in one confederation, private industries are another confederation, and then there's a third one for academics, so to speak. So they have 3 different umbrella organizations, 3 different confederations, but they're not really competing against each other, but are cooperating. So it's simply a different approach with a similar result as in Austria, but still there are different trade unions existing in a parallel, also on workplace level, which can happen in Austria as well, but it's quite clear which union is in charge of what kind of work contracts.
Okay, so again, the question, so Austria is as centralized as it gets, or is there some country that is even more centralized than Austria is?
I can't answer that.
You don't know? Okay. I
think it's difficult to say because centralized is well, also a question how to interpret, how to define it.
Touche.
So when it comes to competition or how clear it is, which trade union is in charge of what kind of workers, it is rather clear. There are still gray zones, but this is valid, I think, for all of the countries. Even if it's quite clear, there are still some gray zones.
And this 70-30 kind of setup that we have in Slovakia, what do you know about other post-communist countries? Is it the case everywhere, or are there any exceptions? As I said, my suspicion is that Slovenia is different, but correct me if I'm wrong.
I think in Hungary, they have 7 confederations or so, for instance, but this is changing, not really on a daily basis, but more often. So we have the situation in a lot of post-communist countries that there are more than one trade union confederation, and some have just been established in the past few years. So there's not really a history of organizing there. And then in my experience, but it's not valid for all of the countries, of course, is that there used to be quite a clear definition what trade union is in charge of what sector. And this has been softening a bit, also because the economy developed and the traditional sectors don't exist this way anymore. And Slovenia really managed rather well in these transitions, and they have had quite a high coverage of collective bargaining for a very long time, a rather good trade union density as well. But I think what is really helping in Slovenia as well is that there is an acceptance of trade union and of these negotiations also on the national level. So there is a kind of a council with employers and trade unions, which is involved in all of the political discussions. So when the government wants to change the law for pensions, for instance, or for care, then they have to negotiate with the employers and with the trade unions how this legal document is going to look like. So they have a really crucial role in the whole policy-making process as well, are really well established on this level, and well, they therefore also have an influence. So this model of kind of social partnership, but in a different way, is well established there, and Slovenia is doing marvelous. So also when you look at economic data, it's doing good. They've got a good collective bargaining coverage. Well, it is a small country with 2 million people.
They are not an outlier. They are the best from post-communistic countries by far.
Absolutely,
and
by far.
When I remember the data correctly, they are about 80% coverage of collective bargaining agreements. So this kind of push that is coming from European Union to increase the collective bargaining agreement coverage, they don't even need it because they're already there. So I mean, there are only a couple of countries in European Union that are about this threshold of 80%, and they are one of them. Just for the viewers that don't know, Slovakia is at 25%. So there is a lot of potential to go up to 80%. So,
and something that I always, sorry for jumping in here, but traditionally it's rather the public sectors that have a collective agreement. So especially in the ex-communist countries, usually it's still the public sectors, public servants having a collective agreement. But when you look in the private sectors, there is nothing there at all, or whatever there used to be simply
nothing
vanished.
is too strong. We have,
it's too strong. But when we speak about 25%, when you subtract the public servants, there is just a very small margin being left over for the private industry. So that's what I'm trying to push here. So it's not meaning that really it's fairly distributed this way.
Yeah, that's the irony of post-communistic countries, that we embrace the anarcho-capitalist mindset mega strongly, and the old capitalist countries are nowadays more socialists than we are nowadays. So it's kind of ironic. Now, when you look at the data, when you look at the penetration in unionization, when you look at the, I don't know, the taxation and stuff like that, and then progressive taxes, that's not even discussed in Austria or all the other post-capitalist or capitalist countries or Western countries. In Slovakia or wherever, flat tax was a big thing for a couple of decades, actually, and so on. So it's mega interesting dynamic and cultural kind of shifts that happened.
But socialism also stops quite soon when it really comes about taxing the rich, for instance. So we have progressive tax systems in Austria, but it's mainly the workers paying really the majority of taxes via different means, of course. But still, when you look at companies, when you look at the super rich, so when you have got more than 1 million euros, for instance, then you don't really pay a lot.
Inheritance taxes.
So when it comes about distribution and justice, there is a lot of room for improvement here.
I wanted to talk about another topic, and it is the penetration of the unions in Austria and in other countries, and the differences that you have seen in all your travels and discussions with the unionists, and the, I don't know how to put it, the willingness or unwillingness of the workers in different countries to be in a trade union. Because when you take as a best example, as far as I know, it's Iceland with 92%, 9-2, so almost everyone is in a trade union. And you go to Slovakia, the last data, official data is 8.7. So that's compared to 8.7 compared to 92. It can go only up.
Yeah.
And the question is, what do you think? Why are there these differences? I imagine in Austria it declined as well. What was the highest peak of unionization in Austria because we were at 65% when I know the data correctly in Slovakia.
I'm sorry, I can't really tell you the highest peak we've had in Austria, to be honest.
But roughly, was it about 50% or 60
similar
or
to
70?
the UK, it would be the 1980s.
What was it in UK?
I think in the UK it would have been the 1960s, but apparently, according to Google, it reached a peak in the 1980s in Austria.
And what was the percentage? Do you know?
I don't know.
Okay, just. Now, please,
maybe
Sophie.
you can.
But I think the question is a difficult one to answer because it does.
If it were easy, I wouldn't have to ask.
My opinion on this is that you can't, as Sophia said before, each country has got a different history as to how it comes to trade unionism, and therefore the history and the historical success of trade unions in the past plays a big part in the culture of individuals. So if there have been big successes with trade unions in Iceland, hence the willingness of people to join them and the recognition, and similarly in the UK, and as they are attacked and lose their influence, similarly, hence the decline. So often the willingness of the political parties to support trade unions or the trade unions give their votes to the political parties that support them, then similarly it will have a knock-on effect on the people's acceptance of those movements.
Now, as far as I know about Scandinavia,
there isn't such a political party or a political movement recognizing the value of collective agreements in Slovakia, and hence who is joining by, for what are they for? What are they going to achieve? What have they achieved? If they achieve successes, then there would be a consequent growth in membership.
No, that's the discussion we were having in the first part with Sophie, that the setup of Slovak unions and setup of the unions in most, or maybe even all post-communist countries is kind of different than in Western countries, and the setup kind of plays a big part on the successes or, well, the lack of thereof. The thing I wanted to jump in and kind of introduce is that as far as I know, Sophie, this is the question, that the Scandinavian model is unique in that sense that the unemployment insurance is kind of tied to union membership. That's, at least, correct me if I'm wrong, at least that's what I understand is the reason why the penetration is so high, because if you want to be insured for the unlucky instance of unemployment, then you have to be in the union, as far as I know. So looks like a model that kind of works if you want to have high penetration in unions.
And well, again, different systems, different histories, different futures.
Yeah, but we should talk about the ideal where we should strive to, and not about the complicated life.
No. Now I have to interrupt you here quite strictly. There is no ideal. I'm always
I'm an
highlighting this.
Idealist, Sophie.
No, there is no ideal. There is not the one perfect solution in trade union setup, because there are these differences in the different countries, in the history. And I would not like to have political trade unions in Austria. One reason is that this is one of the lessons learned from World War II as trade union movement, that we decided to have one umbrella organization, not political trade unions, because in the 30s they were divided. So they got the communist trade unions first, and then it was the Social Democrats and so on. So this was the idea: we will never be divided as a trade union movement. But it works very well for Italian trade unions. And I would not want to force a model of having one umbrella organization on the Italian system, because it simply works differently. And it has advantages and disadvantages here. And about the Scandinavians, they have grown themselves in a way. And You're completely right. Historically, the unemployment insurance by state was very low, so you couldn't really make ends meet. And when you were a trade union member and you paid your fee, then you could receive more unemployment benefits. So this is really a motivation to join the trade union, because in case you're in a bad situation, you will receive money. So there's kind of a solidarity fund as well, which will interest to be there, which worked out more or less fine, but which is also based on the Scandinavian model, that they have barely any legal minimum standards, and they do pretty much everything via collective bargaining. So working time, you have a very rough definition in the labor law, but the labor law is really thin there. When it comes to protection of workers, they're doing everything for decades via collective bargaining, which has been working out fine for them, which has been working out rather fine in Austria as well, that we have a strong collective bargaining. But as soon as political dynamics shift and employers, for instance, are not willing to negotiate anymore, then you lose everything quickly. And this is the situation in some of the Scandinavian countries nowadays, for instance, in Finland, where collective bargaining really was important, but it has been dismantled in the past few years. And trade unions really are struggling right now to keep up, because the employers simply don't want to negotiate anymore. So these are trends that we have to acknowledge as well. But maybe one final word also about the Eastern European, Central and Eastern European countries. I experienced much more skepticism towards trade unions in those countries than in other countries. So I think there is still this link to the old communist system that many people make and associate with trade unions. So I think it's much more difficult for trade unions to sell themselves and their products or their services, their achievements as well. Echoing what Tim said, of course, you have to show that you're doing something in the interest of workers to be seen and acknowledged. It definitely is a huge struggle for these countries, and it's to get a trade union member in Austria probably than it is in Slovakia, but still, to be honest, it is a hell of a job in, I suppose, all of the countries to really
as far as
an uphill battle to change
Yeah.
people's minds, you know, like that, so that when we were pushing through the first collective agreement there at my old company in the financial sector, the reaction of many of the managers and the big town hall discussion they organized to suggest that I was going to be responsible for the loss of all the jobs and the closure of the company there in Slovakia, simply by asking for more. But the fact that I didn't know the politics, I didn't know the history of Slovakia, and I didn't understand the history of communist rule was the things that was being thrown at me, you know, like that. And so they were rejecting it as though I was bringing back Stalinist politics again, you know. And it was a whole heap of abuse, you know, like that. But and my response is, well, look what you have gained, and that what has been conceded by capitalist companies across the globe because of trade unions. The fact that you've got weekends, workings, and maternity pay or holiday pay and everything, overtime rates, all have come through trade union struggles. You know? So, but it was an uphill battle, and we only convince a minority. But we have to work on small gains and the next few members. But it will not. We cannot just say, well, it's 92% in Iceland. All we need to do is import their model. It won't work like that. It has to be historical and the circumstances and facing that particular country's dynamics.
No, my approach is best practice sharing. I'm not saying we should be importing 100% of the Iceland model. That's obviously bullshit. But
I don't believe it can be done at all. I think it has to be
some things that are working, as for example, what we were discussing with Sophie, the different model, not the 70-30 model, because that's kind of undermines the dynamic in the union. When you can't really pay your employees because you have only 30% of the money, then it's a self-fulfilled prophecy that you will be weak. You know, when you don't have employees, how can you grow? It's just by itself. That's and when you can't really pay the attorneys that will be fighting for you in the courts, then that's the same dynamic, you know. And if you can pay someone, then you don't have the money to pay the best of the best. You have to, well, settle down. And when you settle down, then, you know, don't expect greatness. Then, you know, this is all self-fulfilled, and it's the setup, in my opinion, as such, that is causing us all these troubles.
So I can't hear you very well. I think I don't know why. Maybe
yeah, I think your microphone got a bit.
Oh, it's not just me. So that's
no, it's quieter, or it's not as loud as it was before. But maybe I agree to a certain point with both of you. I think it's always good to look for other ideas and to reflect how it is working in other countries and try to learn something. And I agree that there are certain structural issues that definitely could be reflected and maybe even transferred to Slovakia. That's for sure. But I think a lot of things won't work because they work in a specific country under specific circumstances, and you can't really translate that directly to another country. And I think this is also a kind of a culture to fail as well. Sometimes you have to try something in a way of organizing and find out, okay, it might have worked in Sweden, but it's not working in Austria or in Slovakia. We have to adapt it, or we simply leave it, but at least we tried. So I think sometimes you can try, but you really have to understand the context, the respective context where it's coming from. And here with Tim that some models are very specific, and it's impossible to translate them to, for instance, the Slovakian model, and also to get it accepted.
I mean, I am importing my knowledge of trade unions from the UK into Slovakia. So I'm already importing my experiences from one country and trying to make sense of it in another. I know that I'm, despite the fact that the same company is in Ireland, Germany, Britain, Slovakia, Poland, each country is getting different compensation to the worker, and it's got no bearing on the jobs they're doing. The same job being done in different countries is paying hugely varying rates, with the employer being compelled to pay different rates in different countries, often because of historical labor battles that have been won in those countries. So when I see next to no compensation in Slovakia, of course I'm raising my voice, and of course I'm looking to trade unions to bridge that gap. So I'm already importing my experience from abroad. The arguments as to what can be achieved are completely different, because there is no precedent for them to look to in that sense. So I have to be wary of just saying, well, it worked in the UK, therefore it will work here. So I have to be mindful of the fact that their experiences are different with trade unions. That's all I'm saying. So, yeah, but similarly,
there are
the political parties supporting them. There is a direct link between the Labour Party and the trade unions. The Labour Party was born from the trade unions, intent in the UK. Over in Slovakia, there is no such argument, and many politicians, just like in all the countries globally now in capitalist economies, are getting their money directly from businesses to fund their election campaigns. So their interest in supporting trade unions is very minimal.
Agreed. Yeah.
Sophie, last question is about these strikes. The strikes and the kind of willingness to strike in Austria and unwillingness to strike in Slovakia, and about your experience from other countries, and what were the kind of motivations, or how do unions motivate people to strike? Because the ultimate weapon of unions is strike, and well, the ultimate weapon in Slovakia is mega blunt. we are. I guess I don't know whether we are the worst in European Union, but we are definitely somewhere on the bottom in the amount of strikes that we are running in a concrete year. When I was looking at the data, then I wanted to cry. So tell us, please, what is your experience? How did you manage to convince people to strike? And, you know, what's going on there?
Well, actually, we're not very big on strikes either in Austria. So this is the social partnership model, that we start with negotiations, and only when the negotiations fail and we really don't make any progress in collective bargaining, then we go for strikes. And before we really go in a strike mode, it's so-called warning strikes, and that's what usually took place in the past few years. But we've had a handful of strikes and warning strikes in the past few years, rather because of the inflation, so the cost of living crisis, which is true across Europe, but some countries have been hit harder than others. And in Austria, as trade unions, we really tried to bolster this a bit via collective bargaining. So our goal really was to meet inflation, and that every pay rise must be higher than the respective inflation rate. And this is something where we actually managed to reach out to workers and to mobilize for strikes. It was a very specific situation where everything cost much, much more, be it the butter you bought in the supermarket, the rent, or the energy prices that were all under the roof. So it was really an individual motivation for workers to organize, to mobilize, to go on strike. And I'm not sure if this is working in every situation. So in Austria, we don't have a strike culture. We don't have a conflict culture. As I mentioned earlier, in France, for instance, there is more history, more affinity to conflict. And in Austria, there is rather the affinity to bargaining, to speak, to find a solution, and not to go into conflict. So it's not natural for us to go into this strike situation.
Do you know how many strikes you have in a year, roughly? Like,
usually we haven't had any strikes for years and years and years.
Okay.
So it really was in the past 2-3 years that something changed.
Okay.
And at some point earlier,
because
so
when I was
we're not
with
really
with Silke and Verdi, she told me they have a
they
strike
have a
every week. Every week, sometimes even more than one strike. So 50, 60, 70 strikes in a year.
But they also have a different system, because sometimes they have to force the employer to actually even negotiate. In Austria, employer is obliged to negotiate with us via the system I explained earlier. So there is a different setup. Germany functions in a different way than Austria does. But I really want to stress the culture part again, because in France, for instance, I think the trade union density is about 8% as well, so similar to Slovakia. And you wouldn't believe it, because we know France from demonstrations, strikes, a lot of conflict going on in the streets, and this is simply in their blood, in their culture, and you don't have to be a trade union member to go on the streets and to protest. So it's easy to mobilize people to go on strikes. In Austria, you really have to convince them. And one of the arguments in Austria, for instance, is that when you go on strike, of course, you won't receive any pay from the company because you're not doing your job. And then we've got a strike fund from the trade unions, and we compensate their missed salary through this strike fund. So this is something that we refund only for trade.
Sorry to jump in. This war chest approach, is it pan-European? Then nowhere in Europe, when you are striking, you will get a salary from your company, or is it just Austrian and German and Slovak situation? Or you don't know?
I assume it's that the case everywhere, but I wouldn't guarantee it.
I don't think you're going to get your employer paying while people are on strike, because technically they're as far as the employer is concerned, they're in breach of contract.
Because it's a law. I don't know. That's why I'm asking. No, someone who's kind of.
I don't know. I don't know the legal situation in all of the countries either, I must admit.
Because as a motivation to strike, this would be nice to kind of open the doors to strikes, because when you don't lose your lose your money, then you know.
But which employer is going to concede that?
Yeah, but that's the discussion to be had, because when you are sick in Slovakia, the first 10 days or 14 days, I don't remember now what is the number, are paid, and you can be sick as many times as it happens in that particular year, and they have to pay you. It's just by law they have to pay you. So if this law would be extended to strike situation, then suddenly
I think it's somewhat crazy.
Yeah, well, crazy
was
the compensation to get compensation when you are sick, and now we have it, you know.
You cannot surely have a situation where an employer concedes that the workers will receive pay when they go on strike.
It's called pressure team, you know. We have to pressure them to everything else before. This is not important discussion. We have to wrap it up anyway. Sophie has to go, but I just
I don't have to go yet. I think but we can continue maybe for 10 more minutes or so, or 15 more minutes, because I would like to bring in the European, also the EU level as well. I think this would be quite interesting to cover, wouldn't it? Or if it's fine with you.
Please go.
So shall we start now or in the next round?
No. I just wanted to discuss the strike situation. I was surprised by what you said, that you Austrians almost never strike. I thought that it was hard battle every year, but okay, because I was kind of extrapolating the German situation.
Isn't there a strike right now, though, at Austrian Airlines?
We're actually preparing a couple of strikes, because collective bargaining is going very, very bad these days. For instance, in the paper industries and the electronics industries. So we have something in the pipeline, but not there. So sometimes in Austria, when we have got the decision by the trade unions that we will start a strike, this can also lead to a momentum in the negotiations, and the employers start making better offers before we actually go to strike. So sometimes the threat that we will start with the strike is enough to achieve a compromise. Sometimes it's not. We'll see. I don't know what's going to happen in the next few weeks. I can't promise anything.
You don't even have to fight, and you will get it.
Well, at least we have to negotiate, but we'll see.
So the European Union level. So you were in Brussels, so lay it on us. What did you learn?
Well, this is one part of my job, to represent workers' interests on the EU level as well. So as trade unions, we are organized on a European level. I think that's something to be highlighted as well. So it's not only individual trade unions in all of the countries doing their own thing, but we have kind of umbrella organizations, the so-called federations on the European level as well. So GPA is, for instance, member with Uni Global Union or Uni Europa. So this is a trade union federation organizing all of the services sectors: IT, telecommunications, finance, commerce. So trade unions organizing members in European countries in these sectors are also a member of Uni Europa. So we have a trade union family on the European level as well, trying to, streamline our interests towards the European Commission, the European Parliament, and European politics as a whole, because the EU level is getting more and more relevant for the national level as well. And I think it would be quite risky as trade unions to ignore the European level. We do know the European Union as a rather neoliberal or economic project. It was founded, of course, because of peace, but also to have more cooperation in economics between the member states. And I dare say that a lot of the politics that has been done over the decades in the European Union was maybe not that much in favor of workers. But we have had some momentums, and the European regulations and the common minimum standards are getting more and more important also for the trade unions and for workers. And actually in the past few years, we managed quite a few achievements for workers. So for instance, we had a so-called work-life balance directive a few years ago, meaning having an EU directive. Every EU member state has to implement the directive into their own legislation. And with this work-life balance directive, it was really trying to address the difficult situation for families and especially women with children, how to balance their job life, their career, and children, because taking care of children is taking up a lot of time, and sometimes it's simply impossible to have a career at the same time. And through this work-life balance directive, I think there were also some improvements in Slovakia, for instance, to have more flexibility in working time when you have children, that you can bring them to kindergarten or get them there, or if they're sick, that you have more rights. So sometimes we see that EU directive, EU standards really can have an impact and can be an improvement for workers in a specific country. And another achievement I want to mention here is the so-called minimum wage directive, because we started this interview with the question about minimum wages and collective bargaining. And this is, of course, the core competence of trade unions. And we spoke about collective bargaining again and again throughout the last hour. It is crucial that trade unions collectively bargain for workers on the workplace, on sectoral level, for minimum wages, for better working conditions. But in many countries, as you said, there's not a very high coverage rate of collective agreements. So you mentioned the 25% or so for Slovakia. In Austria, 98% of the workers are covered by collective agreements. So that's a huge difference. And one goal we set on the European level as a trade union movement is that we said we need more collective bargaining. Workers will be better paid, will have better working conditions if we manage to improve collective bargaining coverage, for instance, for Slovakia and for other countries. And we really managed to get the so-called minimum wage directive, which sets a target of 80% collective bargaining coverage for all of the EU member states. That's not going to happen from today to tomorrow. That's going to take time. But in theory, also Slovakia has the goal to achieve an 80% collective bargaining coverage rate, so that 80% of the workers in Slovakia have a collective agreement. The question is, of course, how? So all of the member states need to work on so-called action plans together with the social partners, so with employers, with trade unions, how to improve the situation. And this can mean legal changes, this can mean funding for trade unions, or training, negotiation training, for instance. So there are different ways how to achieve this, or different factors that you can put in there. But basically, the EU gave this target to all of the member states to achieve at least 80% coverage. And I think this is something that helps us as a trade union movement as well to improve our situation.
You were part of the negotiation to get it introduced on the European Parliament level, because as far as I know, the European Parliament was the initiator, and they pushed it through. Kind of.
So in the history, it was that Ursula von der Leyen, back then, when she wanted to become president of the Commission for the first time, she had to be elected by the European Parliament. And back then, it was mainly the Social Democrats.
She had to give them some sweets. The socialists wanted something, so they got this. Okay.
Yes.
And another question I had about this pan-European things that are happening there. As far as I know, there is, maybe it was already implemented or it's negotiated, the disclosure of the salaries because of the gender gap. So it's already implemented, or it's gonna be implemented. Do you know something about it? Because in my eyes, this will be a huge help for not only unions, but all the workers, when suddenly everyone will be kind of able to see what the other colleagues are earning. And this, I don't know about your country, but in Slovakia, we should keep it secret, what is our salary. So that's how the
same.
Okay, well, then you will be benefiting from the same kind of changes if it's implemented, because that's the easiest way how to kind of undercut the workers when you don't even have to or can't be speaking about your salary on the workplace.
This is the so-called pay transparency directive that has been adopted on the European level, and now it's up to the member states to make it national law. And I think it's still about 1.5 years' time. I think in autumn 2026, all of the member states should have implemented it on a national level. And this is really, as I said, stop the secrecy. So you can't be obliged to keep your salary secret. And I think this is a very important first step. But also when it comes to the gender pay gap, it will be an instrument, because in most of the European countries, women earn significantly less than men
Actually,
do for the same job.
There is no country where there is no difference.
Yeah,
sadly,
there's a small
even in
difference or larger
Scandinavia,
ones. Exactly.
but it's work to be done everywhere still.
Yes, yes. And in the future, every company with more than 100 workers will have to make a report comparing the same groups, so to speak. So when you do the same work that can be compared, and then you have to compare the pay level of men and women. And if there is a pay difference of 5% or more, then the company has to get active, and together with a works council, with a trade union on company level, they have to equal this out. So this is, I think, something that it is not implemented yet, but that might have a huge impact. And in case someone is online.
Sorry, I just want to clarify. These are proposals being made at the European level, but they would need to be adopted at each member state and agreed. And historically, many of the member states, especially Hungary and Poland, have been very slow to implement existing proposals or reforms. And I think a trivial point, but they proposed and accepted changing the time differences. So every 2015, they first said it was a good idea and accepted all the advice of experts that changing the clocks twice a year was ineffective and actually detrimental to the health of all of the Europeans. Here we are 10 years later, and they're still struggling to agree a date that they're going to do it. I'm wondering, even if, in principle, these proposals that would benefit workers sound very good, but what's the actual date that they would likely to be implemented in all the member states? And they still would need to be ratified by the member states to become European law. And at the moment, we're a long way from that.
Well, in this case, with the Pay Transparency Directive, it's not a proposal, it is a legal text. So all of the member states are obliged to implement it. So it is a European directive. It has been confirmed by the Commission, the Parliament, the Council, so they're all on board. And then usually there is 2-3 years time for member states to ratify these changes and to implement it in a national law. And for the Pay Transparency Directive, this deadline is, I think, in autumn 2026, so in a bit over a year. Of course, you can do it earlier. Some countries have done it. Others will wait for a longer time. Austria as well usually is not a front runner when it comes to this, but takes longer than it actually should take. So I agree that even though legally the deadline is in 2026, it might be that some countries will adopt legislation in 2027 or 2028 even, but then it still is a legal document by the Commission or by the European Union. So the Commission can put pressure on the member states to implement it. So
I mean, it sounds good. I'm just cautious of, counting our chickens.
The skeptical team.
Always. But in case you want to have a look, just one recommendation, there is a project by the ETUC, the European Trade Union Confederation, called Wage Up. And there is a website. So if you just Google Wage Up and ETUC, you will get to the website, and there you've got an overview over the European countries and about minimum wage, so the monthly minimum wage, the hourly minimum wage, but also the gender pay gap, for instance. So how much less do women earn on average compared to men, and also the collective bargaining coverage. And you can also check if these directives have already been transposed or implemented in national law.
Say again,
and you can
Sophie,
check it out
what is the name of the
countries
webpage?
Again. So Wage Up.
Wage Up.
ETUC.
ETUC. Okay. And the last question I wanted to ask is about the future, because we are talking about the past, what the European Union already implementing or is planning to implement, so a couple of months or years. the hearsays from Brussels. You were there a few days back. So what is on the horizon? What might be the new kind of, directives on the union and workers front that might be visiting us in, I don't know, a couple of years, I guess?
Well, to be honest, the future is not very bright right now.
Okay, thank you.
The geopolitical situation with the war in Ukraine, with possible tariffs or other tensions from the United States.
So everyone was crying in Brussels when you were there last time.
Pretty much. And from the trade union perspective, what we hear all of the time is that companies are complaining that there is far too much bureaucracy in Europe. So that there are so many different rules they have to comply with, for instance, to make some reports about the gender pay gap, and that they simply can't afford to do this anymore because they're not competitive anymore. So competitiveness is the new slogan and goal these days when it comes to EU politics. And this is my job, the job of many other trade unionists in Brussels or also active on a national level, that we try to push against this agenda. Of course, having competitive economies also can be an advantage for workers, but we must not forget about workers' rights, and we must not, abolish workers' rights just to make companies more competitive. And this is pretty much the fight we're in right now. So on the one hand, we're trying to defend what we have, which is always a very difficult situation for trade unions. But on the other hand, of course, we try to push for new legislation, which is extremely difficult under these circumstances. But to give you one example that I've been discussing the past few weeks is psychosocial risks at the workplace. I think we can see it in a lot of countries and companies that people are stressed out. There is a lot of burden. Many people burn out, and this is a situation that's not favorable either for employers nor for individuals, for workers, that they are in burnout, that they go on a sick leave for a month, 3 months, a year, 2 years, because they simply cannot handle anymore. They can't do the work anymore, or even do the daily business. So this is something we were thinking about as trade unions we could address on the European level, that we speak about psychosocial risks at the workplace and try to set some standards how to avoid burnouts or stress-related symptoms at work. So this is one idea.
Are they listening? Are they open to this kind of proposals and implementation mainly? Because when you sell it to them as a benefit for them as well, because who needs, I don't know, 10% of your workforce to be burned out? It's like wasted money. So maybe do something about it is actually saves money instead of costs money. And what was the exact idea to implement? More vacation days, or you don't even know yet? What is the? You just want to address the situation?
Yes.
Okay.
And also to give, for instance, trade unions and works councils a better voice on company level when it comes to these matters.
Mm-hmm.
So that there is a lot of on occupational health and safety. So how high the desk should be, and I think there are other elements as well that can feed into it. For instance, one thing we've been discussing on the European level is also the so-called right to disconnect, that with digitalization, with having these devices with us all of the time, we can be reached by our employer all of the time. So when you get a message at midnight, you tend to answer, but then you don't really have the breaks anymore that you need to shut down, to rest, to recover again. So this right to disconnect could be a part of this, so that it's really clear that there is no obligation whatsoever for a worker to pick up the phone to answer a message after working hours. Because we're speaking about Slovenia. Slovenia is, I think, the only European country that has already introduced such a right to disconnect in national law.
I think that the French did it as well, that after there is the email disconnect after whatever 6 p.m. or whatever the number is, and then you can't really be receiving any messages from your company. It's automatically disconnected, so it's not even technically possible as far as I know. to
some
do it
companies
in France.
do this. Some companies do this, I think, mainly. But yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much for your time. So it was very informative. So I hope that viewers and listeners will like this discussion, and well, for the future and bright future in Brussels, and bring handkerchief next time when you are there, when everyone is crying in Brussels. So a little bit of optimism.
Always.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.